We have the great pleasure of being joined this afternoon by Stephen Marche. He is a writer and an author of the new book called The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. We actually found Stephen, we saw a recent article of yours in The Guardian entitled The Next U.S. Civil War is Already Here. We just refuse to see it. So, Stephen, thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
All righty. So I'm going to throw to Russell since you found the article and found our guest.
Well, your thesis is very much along the lines of a lot of what we've been saying for quite a long time. I don't anticipate a good outcome for anybody from the next two elections. And I think we wake up in January 2025 with complete Republican control of all three branches of government. And given the direction that we're going in as a nation, I think the consequences of that are going to be the last vestiges of democracy are going to be swept from the country. I took a look at an article you wrote a few years ago, The Closing of the Canadian Mind, and it was very interesting because, as you're probably aware, down here in America, we know almost nothing about what's going on in the government.
I'm learning that
to the north.
I'm getting that sense.
Well, you went to CUNY, so you must have, right? You went to CUNY.
Well, I taught at CUNY. Okay. City College. Yeah, I was a prof. I was a Shakespeare prof at City College.
So we know nothing.
Yeah.
But a lot of what you described with Stephen Harper, and this is 2015. Sounded very Trumpian, like not allowing questions and not allowing press access and just imposing this just absolute ignorance about the environment. And, we also down here probably have an overly idealized vision of what goes on in Canada. We think you're above that kind of thing. Rob Ford accepted. So why do you feel that that's part of a wave? Because we are, being me and Keaton, I would really describe us as, kind of Sanders left, economic left, populist left. We tend to think the countries that have universal health care don't generate this kind of problem. But your articles seem to suggest that it does.
Well, not on anywhere near the same scale. And actually, the difference between, if you took a picture of like Canada and the States in 2015, and then Canada and the States in 2022, those are some really different trajectories, like wildly different trajectories. And I don't think it has much to do with who is in power. I mean, Stephen Harper, who, as you know, I was not a fan of, he was virulently against Putin, for example, and challenged him regularly in international things. He also was he was the prime minister who began the process of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people here, and he was the first prime minister to identify the Quebec people as their own nation. So the thing is, of course, it's like comparing Canadian politics to American politics is basically impossible at this point because we still have a functioning system and you guys don't have a functioning system. Like your system is in mid collapse, and it doesn't really matter very much who wins in 2022 or 2024. The structural problems in the democratic system, namely the fact that your constitution is 240 years old and it was built for the 18th century, will remain whoever wins. And so, that a good part of the book is about, like it's so easy to get caught up in horse race politics. It's so easy to get caught up in like Marjorie Taylor Greene's Twitter account. And, what is it today? It's Ted Cruz kowtowing to, what's his face on Fox News?
Tucker Carlson. I saw a tweet about Tucker that. Carlson. I haven't looked into it.
It's pretty grim. But honestly, what matters is that by 2040, 30% of the country is going to control 68% of the Senate. You already have a situation where, 5 Supreme Court justices were selected by presidents who did not win the popular mandate. Very soon, whether it's 2024 or 2028, a Josh Hawley or equivalent is going to win the presidential election while losing the popular vote by 6, 7 million, maybe even 10 million votes. And, these what that creates is illegitimacy. I mean, one of the beauties of living in a functioning democracy is that even when the people you don't like are in power, they're still legitimate. And that just no longer applies to America, right? Like that, like, I don't think there's going to be a period from now on when both sides of the country feel that the power in government is fully legitimate. And that's the crisis, right? It's not like the Republicans are going to win in 2022, that in 2024, that's the crisis. You need a system where Republicans can win and be legitimate. I don't see a path to that, right? And so, like, what I would say is, like, the Canadian system, everyone regards as legitimate right here. Like, no one, when Stephen Harper was my prime minister, he was definitely the prime minister of the country, right? It was not a question of, he represented the will of the Canadian people, and there was not a single doubt in my mind about it. And so when that's lost, you really lose a lot, So yeah, that to me is the difference. Like, there is this talk of this global wave, but I do think the specific problems that America faces are really, I mean, that's true, right? Duterte, Putin, Erdogan, etc. But Trump fits perfectly into that pattern. But I do think that the structural problems, at least in mature democracies, like America's constitution is aging out, is what's happening, and that requires, like, more radical solutions, even than Bernie offers.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to ask a question as simple as, like, where do you think this started? Because you talk about the sort of constitution sort of being past its expiration date, sort of. But I look back at the 2000 race as a real accelerating point, because this was a point where you had the Supreme Court, one of the highest, if not the highest regarded institution in the land, intervene to literally stop the counting of votes and hand the presidency to the loser. And since then, we've had a wave of colossal institutional failures, not just in politics, but all over the place. Yeah. From then, we've had Afghanistan, Iraq, Katrina, the financial crisis, Trump, COVID. I mean, it's just one after the other after the other. And that has, I think, really exponentially accelerated the rate at which people have completely lost trust in the system. And I'm sure you could point to, like, certain signals and certain indicators before 2000, but that 2000 election to me was the real pedal to the metal point.
Well, I agree. But the one that is typically given by, like, the experts on white supremacy and so on is 2008. Like, in 2008, with the financial crisis and the failure of the surge in Iraq and the election of Barack Obama, essentially conservatism was proved wrong. I mean, like, there's a lot of ways to put it, but basically facts did not coincide with conservative ideology. And from that, you get that's where the Tea Party starts, and that's where the politics really starts to go haywire. I mean, some people would say the first Civil War never ended. Other people would say, the 60s, the cultural wars of the 60s were the beginning of this stuff. There's a lot of different points. And of course, parts of this are continuous with history, just continuous with American history in general. But, if you're asking me to pick, like, the initiation point, like a point where this starts to really go haywire, it would be 2008, because that's, when you're studying this stuff, like what the experts in PRIO, which is a Peace Research Institute of Oslo, and others, like, they speak of it as a complex cascading system. So that means, like, a lot of things feed into each other. So, like, distrust leads to bad decisions, which leads to bad decisions lead to worse outcomes for people, which leads to bad decisions. It all feeds into peace. And, when I look at, like, where did American enter what I think of as basically a post-policy phase. I mean, where the American government right now can barely, like, they cannot, like, they didn't appoint diplomats, right, until December. Like, they barely have a functioning civil service at times. Under Trump, there was, huge numbers of the State Department positions remain unfulfilled. I mean, whether it can guarantee its debt, like, they flirt with not guaranteeing their debt all the time, right? And, like, not guaranteeing your debt is like being a grown-up country. Like, you don't even get to do that if you're like a third world country or something, right? Like, that's truly, truly dangerous. So, basically this period where government is unable to fulfill basic roles, like not talking about like actual policies like healthcare, et cetera. Those are gone. Those are not in the cards. But even like, let's have a civil service, let's have a State Department. That to me, if you're asking me for a date, it would be 2008 where that really started to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty true. And if I wanted to zoom in on that a little bit more, we could say, January 2009, when Obama takes office, the country was in real trouble, and they were counting on him to help and to change things. That was his promise that he ran on. And going after homeowners who lied on their mortgages and letting the bankers walk, I believe, David Sirota put out a whole podcast series about how that really eroded people's trust in the system, because they had gone through the democratic process of electing this guy who they thought was going to help, and turned out nothing much really changed after that. So I think, if you zoom in on 08, I think that's a good place to perhaps start, and then look at the immediate response to that from a new government that people really put their hopes in, and it didn't work out.
Well, I mean, if I could just phrase it, like ask you to reframe your thinking slightly, because like the thing is, I'm a Canadian. I don't really have a dog in this fight, right? This is a separate world to me. But I would say that by the time Obama comes to office, the trends that we're talking about now are very much in place, right? And I mean, I don't play the blame game. I don't blame Trump. I don't blame Obama. Like, their governments and their responses were very symptomatic of the highly limited scope of what is possible from the federal authority at this point. I mean, when you look at the Build Back Better bill, which is treated as this like major accomplishment, like in every other mature democracy, that's Wednesday. That's a budget.
Right. Yeah.
That's a budget, is what that is. So to pass a budget, like, are we going to blame Biden for not fixing things? Like, Biden can't get a budget passed. Like, and that's not really, I guess you can blame him because he's there to be blamed, but I don't think it's sensible. Like, I don't think that's a rational description of the historical process at work here, that Biden screwed up.
No, but the difference between that and Obama in January of 2009 is that Biden really required some congressional cooperation to get Build Back Better passed. Whereas, a lot of these calls that Obama made right after taking office were within the executive branch, right? I mean, he could have directed his Justice Department to, go after these bankers instead of, homeowners.
I guess so. I mean, he did take over the country at its absolute lowest point and get it to some kind of stability. I don't know. I mean, Obama is exactly the kind of technocrat that, a peace, order, and good government Canadian like myself loves. But, I mean, I take your point. Like, it's not, there are obviously many things he could have done better. I do think, it's easy in hindsight to forget that, like, the situation when he took over seemed on the edge of a new depression, and it did not lead to a new depression. But that said, I mean, I'm really here to talk about structure, which is what, to me, is the real source of these problems. The source of these problems is that the avenues towards legitimate government are diminishing. The capacity for anyone of any kind to form any kind of policy whatsoever is diminishing, and that is leading to a huge rise in political violence. And the harvest of that is horrible.
I was at Christmas dinner. I was actually accompanied by, and you talk about the liberals in your article, and you also talk about the woke left, and she was talking about how, well, maybe it's time we arm ourselves too. And I said, wow.
Oh, it's
you
happening.
Would never have heard something like that from this kind of, West Wing adoring kind of person 10 years ago. No, absolutely no way would they have said something like that. Like, now you have liberals talking about Second Amendment remedies.
Yeah. 2020 was the biggest year for gun sales in history of America, which is saying a lot. And the two largest, the most purchases were by new buyers, and the two largest groups that purchased were African Americans and women. So yeah,
Really?
like
That's really interesting.
So they are literally arming themselves. You know, they are
now,
like,
yeah, and that's something. I mean, I think being armed and ready to go in that way is still more prevalently a right thing, but the left seems to feel like they have to catch up now. It really, like, I've never heard somebody like that. These are the anti-gun people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Gonna...
Well, I mean, when you feel that your government isn't legitimate, you know,
right.
I think the response to that tends to be violence. I mean, that is exactly why I think, you know, from all sides, like that's not a right or left thing. That's a human reaction to the feeling of illegitimate government. And yeah, that's why I think having these serious conversations about things like secession or constitutional convention, you know, also, you know, like one thing that Biden really can do is give the FBI a mission to snub out domestic terrorism with maximum efficiency. You know, those sorts of policies really matter because the violence is rising. And, you know, one thing that is really clear from the research is once political violence starts, it just builds on itself. It just is a self-perpetuating mechanism. And to stop it when it gets going is really, really tricky.
Well, that's something Chris Hedges often talks about in his coverage as a correspondent in Yugoslavia. He often compares it to the situation in America today, how, you know, gradually the people who had been neighbors start to mistrust each other and start to see each other as the enemy. And he's always giving that warning that once that starts, it is very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle.
I mean, it doesn't happen. Right. Like it doesn't really happen very often where like things get to that state and then they calm down. I mean, what tends to happen is the military takes over, and that's what calms down the violence. But that often doesn't work either. Also, in America, which is so armed, which has 400 million guns and, you know, literally uncountable. I mean, they won't even give you a best estimate for how many rounds of ammunition are available in America. They're like, I don't know, 1 trillion. I mean, that's basically what they say. You know, it is very armed to the teeth. So to control the violence is really hard. And, you know, of course, you meet, you know, when you go to these guys, there are people with tanks in rural Missouri. There are people with every kind of weapon you can imagine. You know, like it's not like pistols and AR-15s. Like it's like Barrett 50s and 50 cals and hand grenades and, you know, drones and ghost guns. So yeah, it's and of course, like low grade nuclear weapons have been found in Atomwaffen SS, you know, accelerationist movements in all over America. So, you know, it's armed.
Right. Now you, yes, we are. Although I don't remember the numbers. Michael Moore in his what was his gun movie?
We're armed too. Canada's armed.
Yeah, he
Falling
talks
for Columbine. Yeah, he talks about
Falling for Columbine. He talks about how Canada has all these guns, but they don't have gun violence.
That's true. Yeah, like all of my uncles own guns, but they're farmers. They're not farmers. They're in like acreages and so on. They have little 22s for shooting, you know, pigeons and off roofs and stuff. Yeah, 50% of Canadians own guns, but they're all registered, and they're, you know, none of them are military grade. They're all just rifles, right? But, you know, we're a big country with a lot of people outdoors, you know, like, you know, so, you know, there's a good reason to have a gun if you know, live in the country.
Well, right? Sure. Yeah.
But no one else. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like these like military style weapons, they're scary to look at, but they're not just scary because they're scary to look at. They're scary because it's scary to think of the kind of person who feels it necessary to stockpile these weapons. Right. And that,
well, yeah,
seems to be more American. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I went to the gun show in Tulsa the Wanamaker Gun Show, which is the largest gun show in America. I mean, other than the Sure Shot, which is where like new weapons are developed, it's mostly for the military and the police. That's bigger. But the one for ordinary Americans to buy a gun, it's this show in Tulsa. And it was like 22 acres of guns. I mean, you could not walk across it. It's in the book. Like you could not, it took me 8 minutes to walk from one end to the other at a brisk
almost
pace.
a half mile. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was like you could. It's one of those things. It's like the Tokyo fish market, but for guns. Like you could sort of see the curvature of the earth when you're in this place. It's in the, so it's in the Tulsa cattle market. Like it's unbelievably huge, and they had everything. They had, but also, you know, it's explicitly in resistance to the federal government. Like they, I mean, if you when you go to gun shows in America, like I've been to, you know, about half a dozen or so, they almost all of them have listed when the guns they're selling are going to become illegal, right? Like on a big chart. And like the whole idea is like go and buy that one before it becomes illegal. And the idea is the government's going to take your guns away. That's very prominent in all the kinds of things. So, you know, they're not buying these guns. Like no one is buying an AR-15 for, I mean, there are a few people who buy them for hunting wild hogs, but that's a fraction of the AR-15s that are sold, and so yeah, like they're an aesthetic act of possible resistance to federal authority is what they are.
Well, you also make a very chilling point that a lot of these radical kind of separatists and white supremacists are already in the police forces, are already in the military, so that really they're not likely to take the pro-democracy liberal in the classical sense of liberal side in a conflict.
Well, the military is a separate issue because the military has a ferocious chain of command, and the one institution in America that I would say you can rely on is the military. Now, that in itself is a problematic fact, but they take their oath to the cause. It's absolutely sacred, and I something would seriously have to change in America for that oath to be violated. I mean, from everyone I've talked to, like I just don't see the military violating the chain of command or the oath to the Constitution. That if that happens, it really is all over. But
what happens if, for example, as looks quite possible in the next election? I mean, look, we're of the opinion that pretty much any Republican, whether it's Trump or not Trump, will win in 2024, given who it looks like they'll be running against, whether it's Biden or Harris or Mayor Pete. I mean, unless somebody we're not thinking of is the candidate, we're of the opinion that the Republicans are going to win. Legitimately, not in popular vote terms, but in electoral college terms. Nonetheless, they've passed these laws that have thrown the vote counting to the legislatures, and clearly with the purpose of making sure they get the results that they want. At that point, is the military going to step in to stop something like that? I don't think so. I don't even know what the mechanisms would be for something like that.
No, I don't know. Like that is a question of who is in power. Like that is a question of like who happens to be on the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that particular moment. And I don't think it even depends on their political leanings. I think it depends on their character. And and like I wrote another piece in the Atlantic about like the crisis of the elite, and particularly about like Mike Pompeo, who first in his class at West Point, editor of the Harvard Law Review, nonetheless works for Trump and diminishes the Department of State in a number of ways. And it's very the equivalent of that guy in Canada. You'd have to put a bullet in his head to do any of that. It would never be conceivable that a man or woman of that caliber would violate the institutional norms the way that Pompeo did. And and so it really would depend what the military would do. If you're asking me, I think it is a hairline. Like it is absolutely on a nice edge what they would do in that case. I think they would obey whoever Congress certified. And I think they would follow that, and I don't think they would feel that that's the impression that I get. But that's a really, like, in this book, I don't really make calls like that because I'm trying to stay as close to what I absolutely know, and the models I feel totally secure in,
right,
and the models that I feel, because there are some really, really high quality predictive models that you can use for this stuff. So I don't like to put myself in situations where it really will come down to a character issue. But that's a one example where, you know, the country could go either way, and it depends on the character of the people involved, for sure. I mean, that's a nightmare scenario,
which
too.
It's
probably coming.
There aren't a lot of interviews we do that I find terrifying. Stephen, you've managed
I couldn't
to
sleep a lot
terrify
writing
me.
this book. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of times I couldn't sleep in this book after researching this book. And it was never that people, it was like talking to the guy about corn, like the USDA guy about the corn supply in the United States. It was just like, I couldn't sleep for 2 nights afterwards.
Why?
Well, at least you're up there in Canada. Imagine us reading your book.
Yeah, but if you, like, you know, when America coughs, Canada gets a cold, right? Like,
right.
Like,
true,
you know,
yeah.
we're and plus like we essentially have like, I've worked in America. I was a columnist at Esquire for 8 years. Like, most of my life has been in New York. Like, I taught in New York. I was teaching Shakespeare in Harlem. I got my cousins in Seattle. I got family in America. Like, you know, it's more than just a relationship between two countries, right? I mean, we're just different. You know, we're more or less the same people with different political systems, and so it's you know, no, it's not. I don't feel safe at all being just north of you. Like, that's not the feeling that I have.
Well, right.
It's like the collapse.
It's like watching your big brother go on a meth binge is what it's like. You know, it's like a very horrible thing to watch.
Well, let me ask you something about some, you know, possible either, you know, solutions or at least sort of imaginative ways forward that you kind of hint at in the article here. Yeah, I'm just going to read a brief snippet. The founders understood the government is supposed to work for living people rather than for a bunch of old ghosts. And now their ghostly constitution, worshipped like a religious document, is strangling the spirit that animated their enterprise. The idea that you mold politics to suit people, not the other way around. I thought that was a really, really well put. And because one of the things that happens in the Trump era was the opposition to Trump ran to these institutional norms, right? You know, as if they were enough to save us if we can only restore those institutional norms. And what you're saying is no, or, you know, how I read that anyway, pardon me, is actually no, that's not enough. You're going to have to imagine your way to a new reality that is more sustainable. You know, we just had the Senate parliamentarian kill a $15 minimum wage. It's a perfect example of how, now the norm people are back in charge. Great.
Exactly. I mean, do I even need to say it? Like, does it even need to be said? Like, look, like these basic decisions, like the basic capacity to govern on the most basic level is dissolving. So it's not there is this group of people who I think have really been raised, and they're sizable. And, you know, I don't really mean this as a criticism, because it's, you know, it's hard when you've been educated your whole life that your country's the solution to history and its political system is the greatest political system in the world, to recognize that it's super vulnerable, right? And that actually it is in need of, like, grand repair. Right. Like, and also, you know, it's not because there's anything wrong with the Constitution. The Constitution is a work of great genius. It's just, it was written 250 years ago. And the, you know, Jefferson said that you should make a new Constitution every 19 years. Right. Because he said, otherwise you're making a constitution with the dead. You're making a contract with the dead. Right. And that's basically what has happened, I think. You know, it's, yeah, like, what's not going to happen? Like, I think there are some reasons for hope, but what's not going to happen is things are just going to work out. You know, that's one hope that I think needs to be sidelined. This is not going to be like the 60s, and then, you know, we'll do the 70s, and we'll just all go
Right.
loosh, and everything will be and we'll just all be selfish and disco and so on. Like, you know, that is not what's going to happen. You know, either I mean, the last line of the Guardian piece is reinvention or fall, and I really do believe that.
Well, and you say right at the beginning of your book that America is coming to an end, and I would very, very strongly agree with that analysis. You do in your article, you suggest prescriptions like, hey, enough with the norms, pack the court, eliminate the filibuster, and let them howl about it, because we're past that. We're past that point. And clearly it's been really amazing to me that the Democrats won't even adjust the filibuster to allow a vote on voting rights, even though what Republicans are doing with voting rights means the end of the Democratic Party as a going concern at the federal level. Like, they're not going to have control of government ever again by the time they're done with this. And even in the face of that, they won't even suspend the filibuster just in that limited sense for that vote. Why do you think that is? I mean, even for their own survival.
I think they have this faith, like it's what they have, this religion. I mean, I guess religious would be a really improper, it'd probably be unfair to religious people, but like they have this faith, they have this faith in capital A American, capital D democracy, that this is some way that if they just show the system working again, the other side will be like, oh, you know, this actually is great. And this is a real way to negotiate these things. And of course, they have no other way of really thinking through these things except for pretty radical change, which is extremely remote, right? Like, if you can't agree on sending diplomats to Canada, how are you gonna do a new constitutional convention? I mean, you know, to negotiate a way out of this requires a lot of goodwill on both sides, and the problem is, of course, that the total lack of any goodwill from both sides is almost complete at this point. But you know, I do think at some point the possibility of violence has to make people recognize, okay, it's either these grand things or reinvention. You know, also everything I said in that Guardian piece, that like pack the filibuster, make Washington D.C. a state, stack the Supreme Court, those are all only temporary solutions. Like, even those great changes are not going to solve this problem. Like, that's just a way of really giving the idea that you're going to, by being a decent noble person, you're going to convince the other side that this system works. The other side are anti-government patriots. They don't want government in any form. So, you know, you have to face that reality if you're gonna you know, what is the line from Pirkei Avot? Like, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Like, you know, there's a basic amount of like self-respect you need to have here.
I mean, yeah, you know, it's just, I hear you say that, and it's hard for me to imagine that these people actually think that the other side, depending on who we're talking about, will actually come around. You know, the two words that jumped out at me in one of your recent pieces, I forget where I read this, was death drive, because I've talked about a death drive before. I think the Trump movement is largely a manifestation of a collective death drive, and I think it actually extends far beyond that. I mean, look at what's happening. You know, every year storms get more severe, temperatures get hotter, glaciers start melting. I mean, is this just a society that has a death drive, and certain people in certain positions of power and influence are doing pretty well, and they're making a lot of money, and they might know that, hey, this isn't going to last, but until it all burns, you know, I'm doing okay. Let's just ride this out. Because I can't even buy the idea. Like, I don't believe that Chuck Schumer thinks Mitch McConnell is going to come around. I don't believe it. It doesn't ring true to me. I could be wrong. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in his head, but I don't buy that. What seems much more plausible to me is that all these people know that the ship is sinking and that they're going to gather as much for themselves as they can and ride this out as comfortably as they can until it all goes to hell. That's what seems most plausible to me.
Well, I would never impute motives to people I don't understand, but my experience generally dealing with politicians generally, especially when they get older, is that they tend to have repeated the same line so long and so thoroughly that they tend to believe it. And they can't help but believe it because they've said it sometimes like 20,000 times. And what Chuck Schumer has said 20,000 times is that the US Senate is the greatest deliberative body in the world. Like, he said that on all his phone calls. He said it at high schools. He said it. I heard him say it at City College when I was teaching there. Like, when he gave the speech there. Like, and I don't mean to be ageist, but one thing is that when you turn on American politics, that the first thing you notice is that everyone is old. And I'm not talking old like 60. I'm talking like old, like the president speaking. I mean, it just seems like we're talking about the death drive here, but like I think in some cases these people they're at the end of a very long journey that they are trying to salvage. Right. Like, they are not at the beginning of a journey that they are trying to build something. They are at the end of a journey that they're trying to preserve a legacy of. And, this is not the moment for preserving a legacy, right? This is a moment of crisis that requires a new future, right? And really bold thinking. So even though, like, when people make fun of Andrew Yang, I don't. I mean, like, it seems to me like this is the moment for exactly those kind of conversations, like big, theoretical, technical conversations about how an American government would work, because the one you have isn't working.
Yeah, I mean, the people who piss on Andrew Yang, my question is, what's your fucking idea? Like,
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly how I feel about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's watching it from the outside, and this is something that always occurs to me watching. I mean, obviously you had this with Trump, but even with Biden, how can the rest of the world allow America to continue on in its leadership role or as the indispensable nation? It seems like we're only
hasn't. That was gone.
It has, though, because we still have all the money and the guns, right? I mean, it almost seems like you're forced to allow that to continue. But at the same time, you have this impotent old man who was preceded by a game show host. I mean, how can a nation like that lead the world? A nation that, I agree, because we have such a broken electoral process, has produced these kinds of leaders. But it's all of a piece. I mean, a nation that would produce leaders like this is not a nation that's qualified to lead the rest of the world anywhere.
Well, it's more, I mean, this is all forgotten in the hurly-burly, but like, Trump did call us a national enemy of the United States, like Canada. And we don't forget it. Like, we didn't forget that. Like, it was like, oh, suddenly the biggest military power has a person in charge who thinks of us as an enemy. Okay, this requires some planning about how to get out of certain kinds of arrangements. And I mean, yes, America is still a global leader, but like, of what? Right, because like no one's going to war with America again. Like, that ship has sailed. I think when you look around the consequences of this, like, it's actually very interesting in the context of the German election. Like, when I wrote there's a German edition of this book, and I wrote a special section for them because they asked for it, about like the consequences for Germany. And what Germany is having happened to it is that it's getting a lot more powerful, and it doesn't really, it's unclear whether that's good for Germany or good for the world, but there's not really any choice in it. They are stepping up to pay the NATO bills more as America returns. And like in Canada, it was really common to think of Angela Merkel as the leader of the free world. Like, we looked to Germany policies, right? Oh, absolutely. Like, we look to her for policies. Like, how are we gonna deal with the Syrian crisis? What we didn't ask ourselves? What is America doing? Like we asked ourselves,
Hmm.
what is Germany doing? Like
Huh.
what is, you know, what is England doing? What is France doing? Like like, you know, there's no confidence anymore that like we'll see what America does, and that's probably the right thing to do. You know, like that's not really how this is going to work anymore. So you know, that said, of course, America does have this huge military might, which is still totally uncontested, and this huge economy, which is, you
Mhm.
know, again, totally uncontested. But those are, I mean, that to me is different from leadership. And on the other
Mhm.
hand, like the world is getting more chaotic generally. So, you know, so how the structures of the post-war political order are are fraying as well, as you could see in Brexit
Right.
and a bunch of other
Sure.
things.
Sure.
So, you know, a lot of the institutions just generally are less powerful than they were. But you know, Trans-Pacific Partnership, like United States decided, okay, we're not doing that, and the rest of the world said, okay, fine, Japan's going to organize it, and Japan organized it, and we all signed on, right? Like the indispensable nation is there's no such thing as an indispensable nation, right? Like if history has shown anything, it's that, you know, nations rise and fall all the time.
Sure. Sure. Well, you're saying the world has moved on and Americans just don't hear about it.
Well,
that
well,
that
certainly.
other
I
nations
mean,
are
the world
looking
is
to
so,
Merkel, but we don't realize that.
yeah. I mean, no one is asking themselves, how is America dealing with climate change?
Yeah,
Right?
well,
Like that's not
that
the
would be,
like right. Like
yeah.
that's not going to be like America's power really was aspirational. It's because it was
Hmm.
so obviously worked so well. I mean
Hmm.
that's where its actual power came from. I mean that's what defeated the Soviet Union. It wasn't the military. It was
Right.
like they have better genes and they have better
Right.
music
Right.
and every single person owns a dishwasher. I mean,
Hmm.
apparently the Chinese government came to East Germany, they came to West Germany, and they saw that every worker had a radio, and they all started bursting into tears. Right? They're like, well, clearly we failed. Right? That was what won. Right? That was what, and when it's not, no one's aspiring to be like the United, and of course that's a big problem for people like us who really believe in democracy, right? Who like believe in democracy as the correct global model,
Hmm.
because like America has been the model of democracy, and it's, you know, it's so obviously dysfunctional. I mean, one of the, like my book, China loves it, right? I mean, it's all over the Chinese
Right.
press that
Right.
like they, I mean, you know, not that I would, you know, not that I'm happy about that, but like, you know, it's, they're like, oh look, it's, this isn't working, and what can you
Hmm.
say? They're right.
Hmm. Um, so final question. You said in one of your interviews that succession is basically almost impossible legally.
Yeah.
So where do you see all of this going? I mean, you are contending, which is something I agree with, that America as we know it is coming to an end. So
Mhm.
what happens? Where does it go?
Well, I mean, uh, like I give scenarios in the book, and
Hmm.
each of them, like you know, I give each of them like the likelihood of them happening, and
Uh-huh.
you know, I like, there's a weird thing about prediction, because obviously you can't really predict any
Sure,
actual event, right?
sure.
Like I'm not, and I certainly would never want to pretend that I am. I'm using these predictions as a way of showing the models, right? Of the way of giving the
Mm,
models, putting some meat on the bones of these statistical, very abstract, you know, kind of ethereal theories of decline and the complex cascading system of decline. Um, so I don't really want to pitch a way it would work. I mean, all I would say is, as of now, like as of today that
mhm.
we're talking, violence is on the rise and political solutions are absolutely on the back burner. I don't see anyone discussing serious political matters that would alleviate the rising violence. And you know, if you don't take steps to alleviate the rising violence, it'll continue to rise. And then when it spirals out of control, it's horrible.
Yeah, I just have one final question for you. It was just a thought that I had because, you
Sure.
know, you talk about
Make this one uplifting,
Constitution.
Keel.
Well, I mean, this is just more of
No, the
a
last one, I was like, we can't leave on that.
can't leave on that. But I was
spiraling violence. I mean,
although it wouldn't
has
be
to be something
totally
about hope.
wouldn't be totally unusual for us to leave on that.
People are going to
actually.
be eating their dogs by New Year's 2024. See you, folks.
Right, exactly. Go out and get yourself a nice Saint Bernard or a Mastiff, a nice big one.
Yeah, great day.
Some that'll
Big
feed
dog.
you for a while.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I thought about, as we were talking about, this sort of dysfunction of the system that is just sort of, almost inherent to having a constitution that is this old. I haven't read your whole book yet because you guys just sent it to us on Wednesday, but I wonder if there's any mention in the book, if there's any point, or if if the thought has ever crossed your mind, because it crossed my mind as we were talking. There hasn't been a constitutional amendment ratified in over 50 years. I mean, there was the one in 1992 about congressional compensation, but that was passed by the first that was passed in 1789, I think. And that was just actually ratified in the 90s. But the last one we actually passed and pushed through and signed was the voting age to 18. And I think that was 71. And so we haven't had that process work in over 50 years. And could you imagine amending the Constitution now? It would be impossible, right? I mean, you could never bolster support that you would need to actually amend the Constitution.
I mean, I'm going to tell you one quick story. So, I was at the Trump inauguration, and it was all chaos, and it felt like the fall of Rome, and I'm covering it for this Canadian magazine, and I'm standing on top of a limousine, and somebody lights the limousine on fire, and then I go and buy a pack of cigarettes because I'm freaking out, and I come back, and everyone I'm with is arrested, and they're all charged, and it's madness. And then at about and there's all this violence, and and then at about 3 a.m, this other Canadian journalist calls me and says, "Wake up! You're coming to this party with me in Georgetown." And we go, and it's like a low level party at he's like a kid. He's in his early 30s, and he's a bureaucrat at the Department of Agriculture. And he's taken he has all the pictures of the presidents from the Department of Agriculture on his wall, and his desk chair from his desk. And I'm like, why did you take this stuff? What? And he was like, nobody came today. And I was like, what do you mean? He said, nobody came to take over from us. There was no they turned out they turned out the lights at the Department of Agriculture. And that was the moment where I realized, okay, this is getting serious, right? This is nobody came. This is the kind of guy who's responsible for the price of wheat in 2050, right? The people who keep us alive, that we don't think about, we don't want to think about them. They're just bureaucrats and that we want to dismiss, but they keep us alive, right? They just didn't replace him. There was just nobody there. And so, when to get to a constitution, you need somebody at the desk at the Department of Agriculture before you can do a constitutional amendment, right? A constitutional amendment is almost impossible at the best of times. And the other thing is one of the
but
things
that's what I'm saying. It wasn't
impossible
impossible at a certain time. They would happen fairly regularly for a while until the 70s, and then it just stopped. And there hasn't been one in over 50 years.
They couldn't get people to give a moment of silence for dead police officers on Capitol Hill yesterday. They couldn't get consensus on a cop died defending us. Let's show his memory respect. It couldn't. I mean, that is the level of rage here is so intense that these very basic things are not doing. So a constitutional, one of the things about this complex cascading system is that as the system falls, you lose the ability to repair the system.
Right.
The mechanism for repairing the Constitution, which is in the Constitution, can't be accessed because the Constitution isn't working. Right. And it certainly was the document was created to be changeable over time. Now that's all just given over to the Supreme Court, which becomes toxically political. I mean, I literally don't know the political leanings of any Supreme Court justice in my country. I wouldn't know. And if they had them, I actually wouldn't care. Right. And that's the way it is in Britain. That's the way it is almost everywhere else. Right. So it's, the hyper-partisanship, which is more widely discussed. I mean, I think a lot of more is at play than just hyper-partisanship. But yeah, I mean, the problem here is that exactly those kind of constitutional amendment discussions are the ones that need to be had, and they're the least likely to be had because of the way the structure, because of the way things are structured, and because of the hatred. Was that hopeful? We didn't get to a hopeful answer there.
I mean, that was better than the other one.
It was better than the other one.
Yeah.
I thought you were working into a call to action there.
Well, I mean, I think the moment is coming. I will say this, that, I mean, if any country can reinvent itself, it's America, right?
There we go.
And I believe that. I do believe that. That's not just, let's end the show on a hope note. Like, I do think America has shown enormous capacity for change, way beyond any other country in the world. I mean, way beyond. And, but, I think this book is really about, like, okay, that's what's going to be required. It's not going to be about, getting more people like AOC elected.
Right.
Will there ever be moderate Republicans again? Like that,
right.
That's not, those are not the meaningful issues, right? The meaningful issues are the structure of the government.
Right. I mean, that's what we've been contending for a long time, that essentially the system has to collapse before you can move forward, because this doesn't work. This just doesn't work. This is not solvable through regular order democracy. We're past that.
No. Yes. Well, I mean, it would work with regular order democracy if the system was actually democratic.
Right.
And was considered legitimate by all parties, which, happens in a lot of places where conservatives and liberals hate each other, but they still regard each other as legitimate.
Right.
They still they certainly regard themselves as the same people, the same country, right? Which increasingly isn't happening in the States. So yeah, it is. I think it is a particular historical problem to America, right? Like the state of the political system.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe wherever you saw it, on YouTube, on Rumble, or on Facebook. We have channels on all three of those platforms. Also, consider helping us create more content by becoming a member at patreon.com/do-dissidents, or on Facebook, where you can become a supporter right through our Facebook page and get bonus content every week, as well as call-in access to our live stream shows. Thank you very much for your continued support.